Welcome back to the Elevate Your Life podcast. You guys, I am so excited to introduce to you today's guest. But before we get there, I just want to share with you what an amazing first Elevate Your Life event that we had the other week, and what an amazing turnout and overall success it was in bringing women together from all walks of life to mutually connect, collaborate, and genuinely make authentic connections that I've already heard the women have been connecting, setting up meetings and appointments, and just making some mutual friends that you may not have had connected with otherwise. So it was so beautiful to see all of those women come together on that wonderful Monday morning at the Glam Studio Hair Salon where I got my hair done recently, and I love my new cut. And the fact that we brought in a locally owned family business with a mobile coffee shop. You guys, a mobile coffee shop, like lattes, espressos, homemade pastries. It was just so wonderful. And so since then, we've had such a great response coming out of the event. I have been communicating with a local business owner who I've known for several years. She is so near and dear to my heart. We will likely have her on the show in the near future. But we needed a space that can accommodate if double, if not more, the size for our next event, which will be end of August. So if you want to be part of that, if you're here local to the South Florida area, or you plan on making a trip down here in the near future, try to plan it around that weekend so you can be with us during our next event. I'm going to have in the show notes the link so you can stay tuned for all of the updates we have regarding that, and be sure to RSVP when we have those finalized. Now, to today's guest that we have for you, and the most amazing conversation regarding spirituality, but really bridging the gap between the worlds of science and spirituality, we have Casey Stevens. And Casey offers a unique combination of behavioral sciences, quantum physics, clinical psychotherapy, intuitive energy practices, and mystical studies to not just help, but to guide her clients to somatic embodied healing. What does that mean? Casey believes in bridging the worlds of science and spirituality for human behavior and consciousness while holding the vision of transformation and expansion. This leads to a soulful divine intelligence within, creating a pathway to one's own enlightenment. Through her holistic and clinical interdisciplinary approach, Casey works to guide her clients towards cultivating a deep connection with their sacred inner wisdom so that they may lead an awakened, meaningful life. You guys, during our recording with Casey, we touched on really what it means to bridge that gap in those two worlds from science and traditional psychology and therapy, and adding in the spiritual sense, and how that not only transformed her life, and what were those moments of awakening, and how to really view things that you're going through and navigating those perhaps dark times or times of uncertainty, and you're looking for that clarity, and really just a couple of tools and resources to help you pull yourself through that and know where to turn, how to do it in a way that provides grace, that provides peace, that provides you with the foundation so that way you're not alone. This is the conversation for you. I can't wait for you to hear it. And please leave us a review and a rating afterwards so we know what you thought about it. And find us on social, tag us, and do all the things so that we can follow along with you and share that message with others as well. Sending you guys so much love, and the episode begins right now. Casey, I am so excited to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you. I love everything that you represent, and I find it so fascinating because you take both sides of like the psychology world and traditional therapy, and then morphed into the spiritual side and including both. And I think people really struggle with all of that and more. But before we dive into all of that juiciness, I would love for you to share
and just tell people a little bit more about yourself and your journey of awakening.
Well, probably not enough time for all of that, but yeah, it started for me, I guess, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, when I was having really some big, uh, death tower moments in my own life. And it really required me to choose which path I wanted to take in order to kind of organize myself around that. And so, what I noticed that I really hadn't known about myself at that time is this orientation that I had, that I really just wanted to dig in and solve the problem and move forward and kind of experience this growth because of it. And I didn't really know what that was going to look like. But um, for me, that just meant, being curious and exploring and seeking out teachers and mentors and therapists and people like that who could really help guide me through that process, because I really didn't know how to handle it. But I did recognize that I had this orientation that really just wanted to dig in and solve the problem, right? I was really solution focused. And, ultimately that ended up being a real journey inward. And so as all the deepest journeys are. And so, so I went through this process of really everything that I knew and the world that existed for me before really kind of dying off, and having to rebirth this new version of myself and figure out who was underneath all along, and that I really, wasn't too well acquainted with, and also just who I was, meant to find and what I was meant to discover about myself. And so that was a deep kind of internal process that took years and years and really hasn't ever ended. Once it's been initiated, right, you just keep going and getting deeper into the whole thing. But initially, that's what the process was. And so eventually, right, that was deep, deep inner work, and ended up being me deciding to go back to school and do this work myself and help other people do it in a similar way. Because at that time, what I recognized was that I really valued somebody, in particular, it was my therapist at the time, but she approached things from this kind of dualistic perspective, that she really had a mystical quality about her. And I loved having her critical thinking and the practical tools and psychology, right, that she offered. And it was so valuable to me to have her also show up in this kind of mystical, witchy way that also kind of touched this part of me that, really had been dormant, or I hadn't really been attuned to as much as I should have. I mean, certainly in some ways, right, that was always there, but this intuitive spiritual self really was awakened through that process. And I noticed how much it touched me to work with her when she would show up in kind of exhibiting both of these abilities.
What was, a defining moment for you where it just kind of like awakened you to the sense of, I get it now? Or that sense of like the weight has been taken off and you felt lighter?
Probably, gosh, there were so many. But I think one of them at that time for me, that was kind of like the death of a marriage and a relationship that I had been in for 12 years. And so for me, I would say one of them was really kind of this recognition of and I was so wired to like, okay, I did this and I really meant it, and I'm going to be in this for the rest of my life. And I mean, there's so much more backstory to that, but ultimately it just wasn't like that union had really transformed into something that it wasn't anymore. And it hadn't been previously, I should say. And so I had to really reconcile that, because how do you, carry on with this belief that, hey, I did this and I made this commitment and I meant it, forever. And yet it doesn't resemble anything that I had initially chosen anymore. And we're really not growing together. We're growing apart. And there was so much, kind of destruction and change that had happened. And so for me, I think a huge one was really recognizing, which was really a surprise to myself, even because it wouldn't have been my nature to have chosen to move away from that, this wasn't serving me. I was like almost the opposite. Like I would dig in and keep try everything I absolutely could. So it was probably a surprise to me that ultimately I had to admit to myself that maybe this wasn't serving us anymore. Maybe it wasn't serving me. Maybe it wasn't serving him. And again, I would have been maybe the last person you would have thought would have made that decision. But for me, that was a huge one, right? Of just recognizing that, these ways that we are married or anchored to our own beliefs about how things need to be. I had to really sit with that and reconcile what I wanted something to be versus what it actually was.
Mm-hmm. That resonates a lot. I think as somebody who can get caught up in the potential of what's in front of you because you see beyond, right? And the vision, and some people may say they're willing, but then when it comes to doing the work, they actually stop themselves short. What do you think actually keeps people from growing, from choosing the path of healing?
Well, I think many things. But if I had to distill down, I think no change can happen. Like anytime we deny or defend, I often will say this to people, like anything we deny or defend, we cannot change. And if we don't have the ability to self-reflect, so if we're stuck in denial or defending our patterns or our beliefs or our systems or our structures and ways that things work, nothing can change, right? We'll stay stagnant in that. And also our ability then, which is kind of coupled with that, to self-reflect and self-witness. And if we can't self-reflect and self-witness, then we can't really get to the place where we can acknowledge and be honest with ourselves with what's really happening. And so I think that sort of, to me, if I had to distill it down to one thing, of course, there can be many things, but essentially the ways that we limit ourselves, and we'll stay kind of married or committed to our own beliefs or patterns that maybe aren't serving us, but we're more addicted to that, or we're more, committed to, maintaining this homeostasis at that level. So it doesn't really allow us to expand or, again, self-reflect and ask questions, kind of like the ones I was talking about, at that juncture in my own life, right? Of just like, well, is this what's actually really true here? Yeah, I know it's an idea for you, but is it true? Is it still true? Has it transformed? Is something else more alive or more present right now?
Mm-hmm. And am I genuinely happy? I think so many people forget that aspect of it. I was listening to somebody recently, and it talked about how many people are married 15, 20, 25 years, but yet there's so much under the hood that they're truly dysfunctional and not happy. But yet it's great. We've been married for 20 years, celebrating our next anniversary. And I think more and more people are becoming aware of, it's not about the amount of time anymore. It's a matter of the quality and each passing year. So I love that part of your journey. And it's so powerful because so many women just stay.
Yeah. I mean, I had to reconcile that for a long time. I mean, I did this work for years and years. I mean, I've been in practice over a decade. And a lot of that, I was single, right? I mean, maybe I dated here or there, but I was really single. And it was just like, once I had gone through these lessons and really recognized that I'm not going to partner again and like really do this again unless it's a conscious partnership. Like I can't do that. And yet it can be hard to reconcile and sit with that and see that, oh, everybody else's life, they're going through, like they're having these experiences, but you have to remember, that sometimes like they're not necessarily engaged in that in the quality that I would want to. And so for me, I just had to really understand that, for me it would be a pass if it wasn't that, because anything else would be settling, and I just couldn't ever do that again.
Yes, totally. So when it comes to bridging the psychology aspect into the spiritual, was that experience that you had with that last person you mentioned that helped you with your awakening? Is that what inspired you to morph the two together?
For sure. I loved, so she was also a therapist, and that's kind of how I found her. Of course, I think energetically it's no coincidence, right? There's so many synchronicities. So I initially found her actually to be, at the time, she was our marriage therapist. And, at that time, I know this isn't really what you asked, but what happened was, my husband actually had a different orientation. He wasn't participating or showing up or invested in diving in. And so oftentimes those sessions ended up being, me sitting there with her and wondering, was he going to show up, or, what was going to happen? Was he going to participate? And then eventually, like, we pivoted through that. And it was actually really lovely for me to have worked with her and then converted that into my own individual sessions, because she also had knew him, right? So she could understand and had more context. And I think there's something really valuable about that too. But ultimately, what it ended up being is she ended up being my therapist. So, kind of once that moved away, and I'm glad that she was flexible and open to doing that, because it really, again, provided this context. It was so valuable for me that she could energetically tune into him and understand that. But there was so much that happened with that, where again we carried on, and I ended up doing deep work with her for years. But I loved, she definitely was the catalyst. I can't give her all the credit for so many guides and teachers that I ended up having and seeking along the way, but she was the first, right, that really kind of opened that up. And again, I loved the way that she showed up and was able to support me in a way that incorporated really both my spiritual self and kind of my rational, human self, right? That needed to kind of move through those in a real practical way. And she was able to attune to both of those things. And yet she would tune in, and, we just have these really magical, I mean, I'm sure there were so many moments I couldn't even recall all of them. But just where she really attuned to my spiritual self. And I needed that part of myself to be healed as well and really awakened, because it was such, maybe, the biggest part of who I am. And yet it had really not been, that part of me hadn't been participating in my life. And so I needed that type of a person who could hold that container for me and reflect that back, that it's okay. Like, you can be both of these things at a time, really. I mean, we're talking like, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, that wasn't as popular to do. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
now it's been a lot more normalized, and this healing community and people who are intuitive and working in this way, that are blending science and spirit, are stepping forward a lot more. But at the time, it was really it just felt kind of novel, or edgy, right, to do. And yet it was the thing that was so healing for me. And that allowed me to continue to be curious and explore and seek out other people who could also be mentors and I could learn from in this way, that was really necessary for me at the time. So,
So
mhm.
powerful. I love how you packaged, you know, science and spirituality, because the science only includes the mind and the body
Mhm.
and leaves out the spirit.
Mhm.
And like you said, without including that part, you're missing out on an entire person.
Right.
Um, so walk us through some of the, insights you have and the ways that you've worked with people who maybe were only used to traditional science, if you will, just going through those modalities that only connected the mind and the body. And then once they experienced the inclusion of their spirit, what kind of healing were they able to experience, and transformations that they were able to have?
I mean, so many. I had the benefit, and of course, when I started practicing, I was still, a little, keeping my cards close to my chest with some of the spiritual stuff, right? Because there was fear about entering into this space and having people in the psychology community judge it or not understand. I definitely went through, like my psychology training, and kind of felt like I'm very different than all of these people, and I'm definitely approaching things differently, but I had that framework. And so again, I think energetically, like, there is just no, denying that I attracted people, and not everybody, here and there, especially early on, I would still get people who, if I'm not a match for them, like, I don't, it's just, I can't serve you as well. Anyway, but even if people would come in and they had really no idea, kind of in the background, it's almost like this way that I could work and add benefit to the session. But of course, I love the sessions that we could participate and talk about that. And even if they didn't really know about this themselves, they were open to exploring and experimenting with that. But oh my gosh, so many. I mean, I just feel like when you incorporate that spiritual side, which is really the unconscious, I mean, it's all of these layers that are very quantum, frankly. And when you meet somebody in that way, and when they also kind of consent and agree and show up, something really kind of super conscious can happen. And certainly there, are so many moments, I mean, countless that I could, even explain. But when people would show up, what happens is their healing just can move so quickly, right? Like something that would be stagnant, and frankly, that a lot of the psychology realm, like we can re-imprint problems again by just talking about it or staying kind of in that victim consciousness. It's like we can actually really move through this so quickly if we can tap into that part of ourselves and really even deal in the symbolism or however that might come through. Sometimes it's past lives or whatever it is that you believe about that, but we can just access these deeper layers and levels of ourselves and our psyche and our consciousness in order to really move through and change things, shift things, pretty quickly. I mean, there are countless like stories that would feel almost like miraculous that if you go in and you work with somebody on that level, so much can shift for them immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And so their willingness to do that and meet you at that level, even if they don't quite understand it, is just so brilliant because then they have that experience, right? And sometimes it's like we can't quite quantify that. But when your life can change that fast, or when you can have these shifts and have a whole new perspective quickly, it's amazing. And sometimes it can take a really long time too. I mean, it's not to say that everything is just instant, but I do find that incorporating the spiritual self, we can just move things so much quicker, and patterns that have been mired and deep, just, can really move without being an obstacle in their life anymore.
Right. You take yourself out of your patterns, of your environment, of the situations that you were born into, and you can look at yourself from the outside in and see that it actually has nothing to do with who you are on the inside. And what comes to mind is, when you mentioned that the healing can come across so quickly, is quantum leaping.
Mm-hmm.
And shifting timelines, and what was is no longer the reality anymore because you've shifted.
Right.
Talk to me a bit about quantum leaping.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is, right? I mean, again, you have to kind of start with the basis of my belief system, right? Which is everything is energy. And so we live in this animate universe, and we are exchanging energy with everything and everyone at all times. And so oftentimes we move through this, quantum realm really unconsciously. But when we tap into the consciousness of the quantum field, and you understand that you are energy and everything in you is energy, and so there are just infinite consciousnesses within you, and then everything else is a consciousness and everyone else is exchanging at the same, in the same way, then you can actually start to manipulate and work with whatever those. So if that's a timeline, right? If that is time and space, right? Which is an illusion. And so we can collapse or expand that in any way. If it's a part of yourself, if it's a timeline in your reality from childhood or anywhere else, it's like we can really, if it's a health aspect, it just, you name it, everything has a consciousness. When you start to go in almost like a psychic surgery, and you are working with these aspects of yourself that might be running inefficiently, or there's trauma in them, or there's something that is not optimal, right? Maybe it's not operating optimally. We can go in and in this kind of psychic surgery type way, if that's not too out there for, you and your community, right? What it is then we can work with that energy consciousness within you, and we can connect that however that connects back out to anyone else or into the world and the field, the quantum field, right? And then we can shift those things really, really quickly, because if you're working at that level, right, which is the wave, right, it's the energy, then we can shift things really pretty quickly because we're not dealing with the density that we show up in this human form, right? Which we can be, slower in that realm. There, that the density of the particle and the human life and just how we operate in that way. And so really we can leap to a different reality at any time that we choose to do that. And it can happen that fast. It can be so radical, the change that can come through when you attune to that level of yourself, which is ultimately energetic. And in that way, we can just, energy is fast. It's faster than any of us can ever, conceive. And so it can happen really brilliantly.
So for people with limiting beliefs that think they can't obtain something, or they're fearful of, their current situation and what they're lacking, that scarcity mindset, would that follow them? Or would their mindset also be transformed in that process? How does that work in transforming somebody's mindset?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by would that follow them. You mean the quantum shifting?
Correct. Like, for somebody that, wants their reality to change and, their outer world to reflect their inner world, but yet they still have programs running in the background.
Mm-hmm.
How do they transform
I
that?
would say go right to the root. So when I work with people, I always want to get to the root cause, right? Like I don't want to just work on the surface. I want to really understand and take people back so that they can see those programs. And so it really is taking whatever identity you have ascribed to, which can be again your personality or your persona or your identity, and it's really re-examining all of that. And so often all of those are just facades and illusions that we aren't even conscious of because we really are married to who we think that we are. And so it's deconstructing all of that. And in doing that, what we would do is we would identify what limiting beliefs you have picked up along the way, where those came from, why, and there's always legitimate reasons why we've picked them up. We've absorbed them from somebody who taught us that. We have had traumatic experiences that, this protective part of us has emerged in order with this belief in order to keep us safe. But it's really identifying what is the belief, what is this like, what is the lens through which I see the world. And there are going to be millions of them, right, that we're operating with, but there are going to be core ones that ultimately aren't serving you that will cycle through. And so usually there's a handful of core beliefs that we have that are ultimately limiting and not useful to us. They're maladaptive. Essentially, they were at one point adaptive, now they're maladaptive, and we have to identify how is this belief. What is the belief? First of all, how do I filter my entire life through this belief, right? Because it's so subconscious. It happens so automatically. We're not even aware what the belief is or how we apply it to absolutely everything. And so it's a filter through which we see the world. So it's identifying what those beliefs are, how we apply it, and really getting down to the root of like maybe understanding. Sometimes it's useful to understand where that came from. But if you can't identify or if it feels, hard to access that, I always want to, access that go as deeply as we can. But then really understanding that the belief is separate from you. And ultimately, probably it's not truly in alignment with your true values or your true integrity. And so then it's really understanding who is my true self. And is this belief? I mean, that was one of them for me, for example, that I was kind of referencing earlier. It's like, you get married and like, that's it, it's for life. And there's no like, going back on that. That would just be, what would that mean about me? Right. And so ultimately, I still have a similar belief about that. I want to, show up in that way, but not if everything isn't aligned. Right. And so it's, having forgiveness or permission even around my belief that would have it kept me stuck or trying or efforting beyond probably what was of utility to me and my parents, to my partner, like it kept me gripping to something because I was filtering it all through that belief, and it didn't allow me to really examine, but what's really true here? Again, what's of service? And so that's just an example, but we can have these beliefs that aren't necessarily, again, bad, but they're not necessarily serving us. And so and then reconciling like, oh my gosh, well, what does this mean? And feeling like a failure, all of those things that I still had to work to kind of move through. But ultimately you want to identify, where does it come from, right? What is the belief, and how might I then be kind of filtering my entire life through this one belief, or through these handful of beliefs that aren't serving me? And how do I really go in and work with that belief to understand, what is the true belief? What is actually my highest belief here? What might I have been striving for, but I landed maybe a little off target from that. And so how do I arrive at that place? And so what is really more true for me than that thing that I thought, and therefore I've lived my entire life through this lens. And so how I think that happens is that we deprogram, because now when we're more conscious, I mean, really what changes is sometimes it can happen in an instant and we can just lift it and it doesn't happen anymore. But more realistically, usually what happens is then we have to go through this slow process of self-witnessing ourselves and recognizing, where is it that belief keeps popping up, because it's so automatic, it's habituated at this point. And so now that I have more consciousness about the belief, and I can see that that's actually not serving me, the next time I think and I see myself aligning with that similar belief or acting as if, I can slow down, I can pause, I can question, I can witness myself in that more. So it might kind of be this process where we're kind of gently unfolding, gently, self-witnessing ourselves, and then correcting and choosing a different path. And that is also, the same. There's no, problem how fast or slow, right? Sometimes it doesn't happen that immediately. We could be conscious immediately, but then to kind of unravel the way that has woven itself into our lives, we just have to be conscious of that, and then consciously choose something else that's more aligned for us. And so oftentimes that's what how we carry it through with us, if that answers your question.
I have so many, so many things that resonated there. I guess it comes down to, how fed up are you with yourself?
Right.
Like, how fed up are you where enough is enough? You're tired of receiving the same things to you.
Right.
And I say it that way because until you're fed up, you're going to do something about it, enough to then take that pause, like you said. And it's so interesting. I have actually recently let go of several patterns, beliefs, and choosing to consciously operate differently.
Yep.
And one of the things that was said to me, I was at a beautiful meditation cacao ceremony in the evening. It was candlelit. We had a gong ceremony. It was very peaceful. And she did a little cleansing of us before we had walked into this canopy. And she had said to me, let the patterns go with gratitude. Don't judge yourself for them. Right. So often we then criticize and judge ourselves for believing these things that are not true. For example, I'm not worthy, therefore I show up in situations as less than what I am to validate this belief that I'm not worthy, but none of that is actually true. You take a pause, you show up within your power and your authenticity, and you accept yourself, and all of a sudden the world meets you where you are. So I've recognized, even within myself, I let those things go with gratitude. I thanked them for the time that they spent within me and what they showed me. And now it's time to do different. Now it's time to show up, in my new way. And that awakening, as you continue to shed more and more layers, as you said in the beginning, it actually never ends. It's a continual journey, where I can now self-witness what I would have been saying and responding to these situations with, because it runs in the program, but yet what's coming out is now different, because I'm choosing to pause, reflect, and then respond with, okay, how do I want to show up in this situation that is in alignment with where I am and ultimately where I want to be going? And like you also said, quite literally, the world begins to reflect that back to you. And I think that's the greatest validation for anybody that's wondering, is it working? What's the point? I'm getting met with the same things all over again. Well, once you start to realize certain people are no longer part of your life because other ones are making room now for you, that you've opened yourself up, or things are starting to just happen, faster, or your decision process is quicker. That is your validation. That is your confirmation, is the word that was coming to me, that you're doing the work.
Totally.
And it's working.
Yeah. And it's working. Yeah. I mean, if again, you understand how the quantum field, like nothing is showing up. We are manifesting at all times. Just most of us are not doing it very consciously. So we're not choosing that path, but anything that's showing up in your life, you are a match for. And if you don't want it in your life, and that's a really hard thing to face, because sometimes it will feel like, oh no, I'm why, like, even if, especially if we feel victimized by something. And if we stay connected to that victim consciousness rather than the more empowered stance of like, how am I still a match? It doesn't mean I'm the same as it. Maybe it's that I need to set boundaries around it. But somehow that frequency that's showing up in your life, you're still a match for it, or else it wouldn't be there. And so really going in and having full accountability for that. And instead of looking outward and blaming anybody else, really, I mean, I love that, like really recognizing, hey, if something's showing up, probably it's there because at a certain point it felt adaptive, which would mean it felt protective. But always inherently those things become maladaptive, right? And so it's really looking at, how am I showing up in this maladaptive way that's not serving me? And so therefore I'm attracting these circumstances that initially I was really trying to protect myself or repel from my life, but now I'm actually the one drawing them to me. And it's my responsibility, therefore, to transform that. And so being grateful, and I love that you can do that. It's an important thing to do, not to judge the parts of you that you don't like, right? This is like parts work or shadow work, not to judge the parts of you that you don't like or that were there, because they had a purpose at a certain point, that had a purpose, and they just might not be of utility any longer. And so it's really saying, thank you for, time served. And, I don't need you. This is actually how I consciously choose to move forward. And when we do that, your life will reflect back to you, moments and relationships and instances and like everything that you are now vibrating with, right? And so it's really understanding how true that is. And the evidence is, I mean, you just, if you can be patient and really watch, you can see the transformation that's happening inside of you, because it will always be reflected outside of you. Those troubling or difficult circumstances or relationships or people, or even just a consciousness, right? It will not show up in your field if you're not a match for it anymore.
That is so powerful. I think a lot of people forget that there's still something in you that's calling that in, and immediately they go into, you see, there it is again, like, why does this keep happening? And they outsource the work onto the external people or factors, and forget to look inwards. And I always say, when you're pointing the finger, there's three that point right back at you. So
right. Yeah. So true.
Yeah. And that alone right there is a huge shift in the way that we can view our everyday life in reflecting back to us before we outsource.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, circling back to one of your first questions about, what stops us from healing, like we have all been victimized by circumstances or whatever, and we will stagnate our healing if we hold on too much to that victim consciousness. And there's a part of us that does it, of course, unconsciously, because it wants validation for the experience that we had, how awful this was, or how much it hurt, or the pain we had. And so we'll over identify with our victimhood in any, circumstance, right, that we have felt victimized by. And yet we have to be really diligent and take personal accountability and responsibility for saying, and it's my job and only my job to get myself out of that victim consciousness, because if I stay in this too long, I also will not transform or grow or move out of it, right? And therefore what happens is I feel victimized, so I'm going to look outward and I'm going to blame somebody else for having created this experience, in me. And we'll just get so stuck if we do that. And there's utility, right, in examining that and exploring and identifying again the hurt and being with that, right? We don't want to just rush or move beyond what the pain is there. But if we get stuck there, then we will not move. And so, and that's, ultimately not of service to our highest self and this empowered, um, you know, version of us that really wants to be fully expressed in this life. And so it's really important, right, to examine where are you showing up with a victim consciousness? Like there is where your work needs to happen, right? There's where you need to actually take more personal accountability. And it's so opposite of our impulse. Our impulse would like tell us, well, blame them, or let's get into the story of why this happened to me, right? And it's really understanding, moving not to like moving away from this happened to me. And then oftentimes people will go, well, this is happening for me. And I think ultimately the highest vision that we can be in is everything is happening through me. And if you can really things are happening through you, everything is happening through you, even these victimized circumstances, then we can look at what is our part? How is it that I'm still a match for that? And then we can really transform, because at all times things are happening through us. And so what is it that you consciously choose to move through your life?
Oh my gosh. I've just had so many good revelations here. You taught me something new. I didn't think of it that way before. That moves through you.
Yeah.
So powerful. I think that this conversation is really going to touch the hearts of many and help them think about their own healing a little differently. So tell me, what are some of the ways that our listeners can find you, that they can work with you? And I'll tell you, her content is amazing. Like, I really enjoy the things that you post and all of your amazing content that you provide, because it just helps for people like in this conversation to think about things a little differently. And ultimately, that is how we begin to have that awareness and self-reflect.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. Likewise, yours is really amazing too. And I'm so glad that we're connected. Yeah. My website is shrinkbigger.com and my Instagram is @shrinkbigger. My name is Casey Stevens. So, I always just think like people will know I work in a different way, and you trust your intuition, because when I work with people, it really is like I want people who are ready to take personal accountability. So it's deeper, faster work. It's different than your traditional, psychotherapy, psychology experience. But if you're ready for that, then, trust that and feel into it, and feel free to go on my website. You can also download and get free content like this so that people can just kind of experience for free and sample and try it on and intuitively decide what resonates with them. And so anybody that that shows up, I trust there's a reason for that.
There is. And there's definitely a reason why we connected and I now have you on the show. So the last question I have, and I ask all of the guests that come on the show, what does elevating your life mean to you?
Well, for me, I think it's about like integrity, this concept of our virtue and value system. And I think I ultimately want to move more and more and more into my integrity, which is my alignment with my ultimate values. And my ultimate values are my truest desires, right? Again, it's dismantling. It's almost like, removing, deconstructing anything that I think I know, so that I can really get in tune with what those true values are for me, and then move to bring my life into alignment with that, which to me is integrity. And what could be better than living in alignment with your highest, truest desires? And I think what that feels like on all layers of your being is liberation, right? I mean, it's peace, it's joy, it's like these elevated emotions that we want to experience, where we can arrive back in that place again and again, and we can spend more time in those consciousnesses. And if we honor what we know about our values and our desires, and we live in integrity inside of those, then we can't be separated from those experiences that we ultimately want to have. And so to me, that's the elevated experience, right? It's the evolved, kind of enlightened. Life and just this human experience is going to pull us out of that sometimes hundreds of times a day, but it's ultimately your kind of devotion to returning to that integrity again and again and again, which is ultimately, again, this beautiful experience inside your own being on all layers.
So beautiful. So beautiful. I have so many amazing takeaways from this conversation. Casey, thank you so much for all of your wisdom, all of your knowledge and insights. I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Oh, likewise. Thanks for having me. It's been a privilege.